Picture this. The storm pounding the tin roof of that little Midwest hangar like it wanted in, Evelyn Lang's Gulfstream sitting dead on the ramp with its engines quiet. Elias Crow had the cowling open, his torque wrench steady in those calloused hands, and Evelyn's lead pilot was already pacing. She stepped closer in that charcoal coat, the one that never wrinkled, and said it plain, "We don't pay you to stall us, Crow. If you can't sign it off in the next hour, we'll find someone who will." Now you have to understand something about that moment. Evelyn had no idea the man she'd just brushed aside was the only reason her late father's company still had a clean safety record on paper. She had no idea his name had been locked away in a file no one was supposed to open again. And the question that hung over the whole night was simple: what was it about the engraving on that old torque wrench that made everything stop? Elias didn't argue. He just wiped the rain off his face and went back to the sensor housing. The jet had come down 3 hours earlier with an intermittent thrust fault nobody on the crew could trace. Evelyn's people had already tried the usual resets, the usual software reboots. They wanted the plane in the air before midnight. Elias wanted the real fault. He worked alone once the pilots went inside. The hangar smelled of old hydraulic fluid and wet concrete. His daughter, 12-year-old May, sat on an upside-down bucket near the wall, reading under the work light the way she did most evenings he couldn't leave the strip. She never asked why they lived so far from anywhere. She just knew the work kept the lights on. On the third pass with the torque wrench, the numbers didn't line up. Elias set the tool down and pulled the inspection panel farther back. There, tucked behind a wiring bundle that shouldn't have been touched since the last overhaul, was a cracked actuator fitting. Not a software glitch. A part. The same supplier mark he hadn't seen in 14 years. He didn't say anything yet. He just laid the wrench across the open panel so the light caught the engraving, faded wings and the words, "Hands that never lied." The motto had been there since the day he received the tool. He never talked about where it came from. Evelyn came back out at 10:30, still in the coat, still checking her watch. Lillian had flown in on the company shuttle to meet them and was standing a little apart, quiet the way she always was when business moved fast. Evelyn looked at the open panel and the untouched test equipment. "You're still at it," she said. Elias straightened. "Parts bad. Same batch that showed up on the H-9 test frames back in the day. I won't sign until we pull the logs." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "That was a long time ago. We fly on the data we have now." May looked up from her book but didn't speak. Elias kept his voice even. "Data's only as good as the part that made it. Give me till morning and I'll show you the chain." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then nodded once, short. "You have until the weather breaks. After that we decide." She turned to leave, and that was when Lillian stepped closer to the workbench. Her eyes found the torque wrench. She went still the way people do when a name they haven't said in years rises without warning. She didn't speak right then. She just touched the edge of the handle once, lightly, as if checking whether it was real. Outside, the rain kept on. Inside, Elias began clearing space for a full overnight check he already knew would run longer than any of them expected. That first night stretched out under the hangar lights like it had no end. Elias worked the logs by hand, cross-checking each entry against the old supplier codes he still carried in his head. The rain hammered the roof in steady waves, and every so often he'd reach for the torque wrench just to feel the weight of it again. Lillian stayed close, saying little, but her eyes kept drifting back to that engraving. You could tell she recognized it. The way her fingers had hovered earlier told the story plain enough. Around 1 in the morning the new mini-crisis arrived without warning. The digital records Evelyn's team had sent over came back corrupted on 3 separate pages. Missing serial numbers. Dates that skipped forward 2 weeks. Evelyn's assistant called from the main office to say the weather front was holding longer than forecast. Now they had until noon the next day, not morning. Evelyn's voice stayed cool on the speakerphone. "We can't ground the whole fleet on one man's memory, Elias. Send what you have by 8. May had fallen asleep on the bench with her book still open. Elias looked at the blank screens and felt the old weight settle in his chest. 40 years of keeping planes in the air, and it all came down to whether a set of numbers would print. He didn't argue. He simply pulled the paper logs from the bottom drawer, the ones the company had scanned and then boxed away years ago, and laid them out beside the wrench. Lillian moved closer without being asked. She read the faded ink in silence, then pointed to one line. "That batch went to the test frames in '89. Your name's on the approval stamp." Elias nodded once. He didn't explain how he'd kept the originals all this time or why the company had never asked for them back. He just started copying the chain by hand, one careful line at a time, while the rain kept time overhead. By 3 the power flickered twice. The third time it stayed off. The backup lights kicked on, thin and yellow, and the temperature in the hangar dropped fast. Evelyn's assistant called again to say the server room had lost connectivity. "We'll have to wait until morning to verify anything," the voice said. Lillian spoke for the first time in hours. "He doesn't need the server." Her tone was quiet but steady, the same way she'd always spoken when the boys were small and the hangar felt too big. She picked up the torque wrench and set it on the paper so the light caught the wings again. "He needs the part numbers and the dates. Those haven't changed." Elias kept writing. Every so often he would stop, run his thumb along the wrench handle, and check a column against the actuator that still sat on the bench. The supplier mark matched. The crack was real. And somewhere in the back of his mind the old test flights came back. The ones where that same fitting had nearly cost a crew their lives until someone had pulled the whole batch. 4:30 came and went. The rain eased to a steady drip off the eaves. Elias finished the last page, set the pencil down, and looked at Lillian. "You remember the H-9 frames too?" She gave a small nod. "I remember who signed them off when no one else would." Outside the hangar the sky stayed dark, but the countdown had already begun. 11 hours until Evelyn's decision. 11 hours until the logs had to stand on their own. Elias covered the actuator with a clean cloth, placed the torque wrench beside it, and turned to clear space for the morning light. Lillian stayed where she was, one hand resting lightly on the bench, as if the wrench might vanish if she looked away. The night wasn't over yet, but the first real crack in the official story had already shown itself. You have to picture the way that torque wrench sat there under the yellow backup lights, its handle worn smooth from decades of use, catching just enough gleam to remind Elias of every airframe he'd torqued by hand back when the manuals were still written on carbon paper. Lillian kept her palm resting near it, like the tool itself might steady the room. By 6 the rain had stopped altogether, leaving only the drip-drip off the hangar eaves and the low hum of the generator trying to keep the server racks alive in the next building over. Elias stood, stretched the ache out of his back, and walked the length of the bench one more time. 11 hours. That was the number Evelyn's assistant had left them with. At 7:15 the first mini-crisis arrived without warning. The side door opened and a young man in a pressed company jacket stepped through, clipboard already flipped open. "Evelyn sent me to collect the actuator for the morning review," he said, voice bright and sure of itself. "She wants it logged under the new part number system before the board call." Lillian didn't move. Elias simply lifted the clean cloth and showed the crack running straight through the supplier mark. "That number's already been logged," he said quietly. "Twice. Once in '87 and once after the H-9 retrofit." The young man glanced at his clipboard as if the paper could override the metal sitting on the bench. "Those records aren't in the current database. Evelyn said anything not digitized has to be treated as scrap. Here's the part the kid couldn't see: Elias had written those exact numbers himself, 40 years earlier, on the same kind of lined paper now sitting under the torque wrench. The handwriting on the fresh pages matched the old maintenance books word for word. Lillian watched the recognition flicker across the young man's face when Elias pointed to the date stamp on the actuator itself, still legible under the grime. "You can tell Evelyn the part stays here until the numbers check against the original drawings," Elias said. "Not the database. The drawings." The young man left without the actuator, door closing a little harder than it needed to. Outside, the sky was just starting to turn gray. 10 hours left. They spent the next stretch in near silence, Elias copying one more column while Lillian kept the torque wrench in easy reach. Every so often she would lift it, test the weight, and set it back down exactly where the light would hit the engraved wings. The motion seemed to steady both of them. At 9 the phone rang again. Evelyn's voice this time, clipped but still polite. "I'm told you're refusing to release the component." Elias kept his answer short. "I'm refusing to let it be logged under the wrong history. There's a difference." A pause stretched long enough for the generator to click off and on again. Then Evelyn said, "We'll settle it at the review table tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you have." The line went dead before he could answer. 9 hours. Lillian folded the top sheet of copied notes and slipped it inside the front cover of an old logbook she'd pulled from the bottom drawer, the one with the faded Union sticker on the spine. She didn't say where she'd found it, and Elias didn't ask. The torque wrench stayed on the bench between them, a quiet anchor while the hangar warmed back up with the morning light. Outside, the first trucks were arriving for the day shift. Inside, the two of them kept working, one careful line at a time, the same way they had through every other tight deadline the plant had ever handed them. The official story was still standing, but another hairline crack had appeared in it, and both of them could feel it widening with every hour that ticked away. 8 hours left, and the hangar felt smaller with every minute that passed. Lillian pulled the old logbook closer, her fingers tracing the Union sticker like it was a map she hadn't opened in years. Elias kept copying the actuator specs into the margin, the numbers falling into place the way they always had when he'd first sketched the tolerances himself, back when the plant still trusted the hands that built the original line. He didn't say that part out loud. He just wrote. The phone stayed quiet, but the door didn't. A little after 8:30 a second young man arrived, this one carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of tie that belonged on a salesman, not a mechanic. He introduced himself as from Evelyn's office and said the actuator was needed for a morning demonstration. No discussion. Elias looked at the torque wrench lying on the bench, wings catching the light again, then back at the visitor. "You can tell her the demonstration will have the wrong numbers if she uses the database copy," Elias said. "These actuators were spec'd before the digital changeover. The drawings are the only record that matches the serial plate." The young man shifted his weight. "Ms. Harlan wants it on the review table at 7 sharp. Lillian lifted the wrench again, testing the balance the way she had the night before, then set it down so the engraving faced the door. The motion seemed to settle something in the room. The visitor left the actuator where it sat and walked out slower than he'd come in. 7 hours. They ate the last of the sandwiches from the night shift cooler, neither one saying much. Every so often Elias would stop writing and rest his palm on the logbook cover, as if the faded sticker could remind him of the exact shift when the plant had decided the paper records were too old to keep. The generator hummed steady now, and the morning light had turned the concrete floor a warmer gray. At 6:40 the next call came. Evelyn again, voice still clipped but thinner around the edges. "I've been told the component is locked. I need it for the table." Elias kept the receiver to his ear and answered without raising his voice. "It's not locked. It's waiting for the right history." Bring the drawings from the archive room and we'll settle it there. A longer pause this time. Then Evelyn asked, almost quietly, "You still have the original set?" He didn't answer that directly. He just said the review table would have what it needed if she brought the right papers. The line clicked off. 5 hours left. Lillian folded another sheet of notes and slid it into the logbook beside the first. The torque wrench stayed between them, its wings picking up the low sun that angled through the high windows. Outside, the day shift trucks were backing into their bays, the familiar diesel smell drifting in whenever the door opened. Inside, the two of them worked the same steady line they had followed through every other deadline, one column at a time, while the hairline crack in the official story kept widening, quiet and sure, with every hour that still remained. Now, you have to understand how these old plants ran on more than just the new schedules pinned to the wall. Lillian had spent 38 years on that floor, first as a welder's apprentice, then as the one they called when a tolerance slipped by 1,000th. Elias had been her shift partner for the last 12 of them, the kind of man who still kept a union card in his wallet even after the card itself had gone soft at the edges. Between them the logbook lay open, its pages marked with the same careful hand that had logged every serial number since 1979. 3 hours and 40 minutes remained. The next knock came from the loading dock side, not the office hallway. A man in a company windbreaker stood there holding a clipboard and a chain of custody form already signed in 3 places. "Ms. Harlan says the actuator has to move now. Security's waiting at the gate." He kept his eyes on the paper, the way people do when they've been told not to look at faces. Lillian didn't stand. She simply turned the torque wrench so the engraving caught the light again, then slid the logbook across the bench until the form number on the clipboard matched the faded entry on the page. "That chain's missing the original transfer date," she said. "You bring the archive copy and we'll fill it in together." The man shifted, checked his watch, then left without the actuator. The door closed behind him with the same soft click the visitor had made earlier. Elias wrote the time in the margin. 2 hours and 55 minutes. You could hear the day shift settling into their stations outside, the low rumble of forklifts and the occasional shout about a missing pallet. Inside, the concrete stayed cool under their boots. Lillian refolded the note she had added the night before and tucked it behind the one from the morning. The wrench rested between them, its wings still catching the angle of the high windows. Every so often one of them would rest a hand on the logbook cover, the way a person might touch an old photograph to make sure the faces were still there. The phone rang again at 10 minutes to the hour. Evelyn's voice had lost some of its edge. "The review table is set. They're asking why the component isn't on it yet." Elias kept the receiver steady. "We're bringing the history that belongs with it. The table will wait." There was a pause long enough to hear the background murmur of voices, then the line went quiet. 2 hours and 10 minutes. A new sound entered the room then, the scrape of a chair being moved in the hallway outside. Someone had stopped just beyond the door, listening. Lillian lifted the wrench once more, tested the weight, and set it down so the engraving faced outward. The footsteps moved on. Neither of them spoke about it. They simply went back to the columns, one line at a time, the generator's steady hum filling the space between the numbers. The hairline crack kept opening, slow and sure, with every minute that still belonged to them. The clock on the far wall ticked past the hour mark, and you could feel the room stretch thinner with every swing of the second hand. Elias glanced at the logbook again, then at the torque wrench lying between them like a promise nobody else had read yet. 17 hours and 40 minutes, he said quietly, as if the number needed to be spoken into existence. Lillian nodded once and turned the next page, her finger tracing the faded ink where an original signature had been crossed through and re-entered by someone who never flew the airframe themselves. The door opened without a knock this time. A younger man in a pressed shirt and company lanyard stepped inside, clipboard already angled for inspection. "Quality wants the actuator on the table by noon," he said, voice carrying the same clipped tone Evelyn had used earlier. "They sent me to collect it." He reached for the part, but his hand stopped when he saw the wrench resting across the bench, engraving turned outward. The letters caught the light the same way they had for the man before him. The visitor's eyes flicked to the logbook, then back to Lillian's steady hand holding the page open. Lillian didn't argue. She simply lifted the wrench again, set it down with deliberate weight, and asked whether he had brought the archive copy she'd requested. The man shifted his weight, checked the clipboard as though the answer might be written there, and admitted he hadn't. "They said the current form would do." Elias kept his voice even. "The current form misses the original transfer date. Without it the chain breaks, and the review table will notice." The man looked at his watch again, then at the concrete floor, then left the same way the first one had, the soft click of the latch marking another interval. Inside, the generator kept its steady hum. Lillian refolded the note once more and slid it deeper behind the morning page, the paper edge just visible if you knew where to look. The symbolic weight of that torque wrench seemed to grow with every passing minute, its wings reflecting the high windows like a quiet signal only the three of them understood. Elias added the new time in the margin. 17 hours and 10 minutes. The hairline crack in the schedule kept widening, but so did the column of verified entries. A new sound reached them then, the scrape of shoes stopping again just outside the door, followed by the low murmur of two voices. One belonged to the man who had just left, the other was unfamiliar, sharper, asking why the components still sat on the bench. Elias picked up the receiver before the phone could ring and spoke first when Evelyn answered. "We're preserving the chain of custody. Tell the table the history arrives with the part or not at all." The line stayed open long enough for the background voices to register, then went quiet. Lillian rested her palm on the logbook cover the way someone might steady an old friend. The engraving on the wrench caught the light once more as she turned it slightly, and for a moment the room held the same cool stillness it had when the day began. Outside, the forklifts rumbled on, but inside the two of them continued line by line, the minutes belonging to them growing fewer while the documented history grew more complete. 17 hours remained, and the crack continued its slow, deliberate opening. Now, you have to picture the way that clock on the wall kept its steady tick, louder than the generator once you noticed it. 16 hours and 40 minutes left before the review table would sit down with their pens and their questions. Lillian shifted the logbook an inch closer to the light, and the folded note stayed tucked where she'd left it, the corner just peeking out like a reminder only they could see. A new set of footsteps stopped outside the door. This time the voice belonged to a woman in a pressed navy blazer, the kind of fabric that still held its crease at the end of a long day. She stepped in without knocking and asked if anyone had verified the original purchase order number. Elias set the receiver down gently and turned to face her. "We're matching it against the maintenance logs from 1978, he said, voice even as ever. She glanced at the torque wrench on the bench, its wings catching the high window light again, then back at him. "That part number wasn't on the manifest we were given." Lillian reached for the top drawer without a word and slid out the yellowed carbon copy she'd kept from the first rebuild. The paper smelled faintly of machine oil and the cedar box it had lived in for decades. The woman read it once, then again, her mouth tightening at the corners. "This wasn't in the file forwarded to us." Elias nodded once. "It never left this bench until today." She initialed the margin, the pen scratching loud in the quiet room, and left with the same measured steps she'd used coming in. The door clicked shut behind her, marking another small interval one back. 15 hours and 50 minutes now. The crack in the schedule had widened just enough to let in a draft of cooler air from the loading dock. Elias added the new verification to the column, his handwriting the same careful block letters he'd used on every log since the plant's early days. Lillian rested her hand on the wrench handle for a moment, the metal cool under her palm, then turned back to the next line. The note stayed where it was, safe behind the morning page, its weight growing with each fresh signature they secured. A short while later the phone rang again. Evelyn's voice on the other end carried the edge of someone who'd been fielding calls all afternoon. "They're asking why the component wasn't moved to the main floor yet." Elias kept the receiver steady. "Because the chain has to hold all the way through. Tell them the history travels with the part." He listened a moment, then added the exact time in the margin beside the latest entry. Lillian watched the second hand on the wall clock sweep past the hour mark, the generator's hum filling the space between sentences. The next knock came softer. A younger man in a gray work shirt stepped halfway inside, clipboard in hand, and admitted he couldn't locate the second witness signature from the 1994 overhaul. Elias didn't look up right away. "Check the back page of the same folder," he said. The man found it, initialed it where indicated, and the torque wrench caught the light once more as Lillian shifted it an inch to make room for the new paperwork. 15 hours remained, the column of verified entries lengthening while the door opened and closed on its own quiet rhythm. The phone rang once more before the hour turned, and this time Evelyn's voice came through tighter than before. "They want a fresh affidavit on the 1994 work," she said. "Someone on their end is claiming the overhaul log could have been altered after the fact." Elias set the receiver down long enough to look across at Lillian. "You remember who signed that particular page?" he asked. She nodded, already reaching for the folder again. "Harold kept the carbon copy in the lockbox under the bench," she said. The lockbox opened with the same soft click it had made for 30 years, and the carbon sheet slid out without a crease. Elias read the date aloud into the phone, then added the time stamp beside the new entry. 15 hours still, but the margin on the logbook had grown crowded with those careful block letters. Lillian turned the torque wrench a half turn on its cloth, just enough to keep the light from the dock window off the metal. The note stayed tucked where it had been since morning, its folded edge now pressed flat under the weight of 3 new verification sheets. A younger man came back a second time, this time with a supervisor whose tie looked too tight for the heat in the room. "We need to move the component before the shift change," the supervisor said. Elias didn't raise his voice. "It moves when every line is witnessed," he answered. The supervisor checked his own clipboard, saw the chain of signatures already running down the page, and left without another word. The door closed on its own soft rhythm again. 14 hours and 40 minutes now. The generator hummed steady through the silence that followed. Evelyn called once more to say the main floor had started asking why the history had to travel at all. "Tell them the part was never just a part," Elias said into the receiver. He listened, then wrote the caller's name and the exact minute in the margin. Lillian watched the second hand sweep past the next mark on the wall clock and rested her hand on the wrench handle again, the cool metal steady under her palm. The note's weight had grown just enough that she could feel it through the folder whenever she reached for the next blank line. Another knock, softer still. This time it was a woman from records who admitted she couldn't find the original purchase order from the first installation. Elias pointed to the back of the same folder without looking up. She found it, initialed the margin where he indicated, and the torque wrench caught the light once more as Lillian shifted the cloth to keep the metal from sticking to the wood. The supervisor returned with 2 more people from the front office, both in pressed shirts that didn't belong on the loading dock. "We're being asked to confirm the entire chain before we can release the crate," one of them said. Elias nodded once. "That's what we're doing," he answered. He slid the carbon copy across the bench so they could see the date and the 2 witness signatures from 1994. The room stayed quiet while they read. 14 hours remained. The column of verified entries kept lengthening, each new initial another small interval one back. Evelyn's next call carried news that the buyer's representative had arrived early and was waiting in the main conference room. "They're asking for the component to be brought up under guard," she said. Elias kept the receiver steady. "It comes up when the log is complete," he said, and he added the time beside the latest entry. Lillian turned the page in the folder, the note still safe behind the morning sheet, its folded edge now visible only if someone lifted the whole stack. The generator's hum filled the space between the next knocks and the next signatures, and the door kept opening and closing on its own quiet rhythm while the countdown moved forward 1 minute at a time. 13 hours remained, and the loading dock had settled into that steady rhythm you get when everyone knows the clock isn't theirs to argue with. Lillian kept her palm on the torque wrench, the metal cool enough now that the cloth didn't fight her anymore. Another call came through on the wall phone. Evelyn's voice, quieter this time, said the buyer's representative had started checking his own watch every few minutes and asking why the crate couldn't be moved while the paperwork caught up. Elias listened, wrote the minute down, and answered without raising his tone. "It moves when the log is finished," he said, then hung up and added the time beside Evelyn's name. The woman from records returned with a question about a second installation date that didn't line up with the 1994 entry. She held the carbon copy under the bench light and pointed to a faded stamp in the corner. Elias didn't reach for it. He nodded toward Lillian instead. She lifted the corner of the folder just enough to show the original work order tucked behind the morning sheet, the one with her own initials from 3 decades earlier, small and neat beside the foreman's larger ones. The woman initialed the margin, satisfied, and left without another word. The note stayed hidden, its folded edge pressed flat again by the time the door clicked shut. 12 hours and 50 minutes. The generator's hum picked up for a moment, then settled back, and the next knock brought the supervisor with a different pair of pressed shirts, this time from legal. They wanted to know whether the component had ever left the premises between the original install and the current crate. Elias slid the log across the bench so they could see the unbroken chain of custody stamps, each one dated and witnessed. One of the men leaned closer, studying the ink, and for a second his eyes rested on the folder's edge where the note sat. Lillian shifted the wrench an inch, the metal catching the light just enough to draw his attention back to the page. He initialed, thanked Elias, and the two of them stepped out. You could feel the room breathing again once they were gone. Lillian turned the next blank line and wrote the time herself. The note's weight had become familiar now, like the handle of a tool you'd used long enough to stop noticing until someone else tried to take it. Evelyn called once more to say the buyer's representative had asked to speak directly to whoever was keeping the log. Elias took the receiver, listened, and answered the same way he had answered every other call that morning. "When the entries are complete," he said, then added the minute beside the latest signature. 11 hours left. The dock stayed quiet between knocks, the only sound the generator and the occasional scrape of the cloth under the wrench. A new face appeared, this one from shipping, younger, carrying a clipboard and a worried expression about the crate's weight limits on the freight elevator. Elias pointed to the original specification sheet still clipped inside the folder. The young man read it twice, checked the numbers against his own sheet, and initialed without argument. Lillian watched the second hand sweep past the next mark on the wall clock and let her fingers rest on the note's folded edge for just a moment before pulling them back. The day moved that way, one verification at a time, each new initial another small piece of ground held. The note stayed where it was, safe behind the morning sheet, its presence felt only when Lillian reached for the next line or when the folder shifted under someone else's hand. 11 hours and change, the countdown kept its own quiet count, and the door kept opening and closing on the same measured rhythm while the log lengthened and the crate stayed exactly where it was. 11 hours turned into 10, and the knocks at the door came a little faster now. A man in a pressed navy blazer from the buyer's office stood just inside the threshold, demanding the crate be opened for a spot inspection before the numbers could be locked in. Elias looked at Lillian, then back at the folder. The note lay quiet under the top sheet, its corner barely visible, the same way it had rested all morning. You could see the tension pull across Lillian's shoulders, the way it always did when someone half her age tried to rewrite a procedure she had written herself 40 years earlier. She reached for the wrench again, not to threaten, just to rest her hand on something solid while the representative explained that his firm needed proof the contents matched the manifest before they wired the final payment. Here's the part the young man in the blazer didn't know: Lillian had packed that crate herself, late one night when the rest of the crew had gone home, because no one else remembered how the old locking pin seated without damaging the threads. She didn't say a word about it. Instead she slid the original specification sheet toward him, the one with her own faded initials from the first draft, and waited. The representative read it, frowned, and asked for the torque sequence again. Elias recited it exactly as Lillian had written it down years ago. The man initialed, but his pen hovered an extra second over the note's edge before he pulled back. Lillian shifted the wrench an inch so the light caught the metal once more, and the moment passed. The door closed behind him, and the room settled into its rhythm again. 9 hours left. The generator hummed steady, the cloth under the wrench made its small scraping sound each time Lillian reached for the next line in the log. Evelyn called once more with word that the freight elevator crew wanted confirmation the weight distribution matched the drawings. Elias answered the same way he had all day, when the entries are complete, and added the time beside the signature. Then a second knock, this one from the insurance adjuster. He carried a printed copy of the original purchase order and claimed the crate's declared value didn't line up with the buyer's latest appraisal. He wanted the entire log rechecked line by line, right there, before the truck could even be scheduled. Lillian felt the note's folded edge under her fingertips again, that familiar weight, and she wondered how many more times that small piece of paper would have to do the work of proving what everyone in the room already should have known. The adjuster started reading the first entry aloud. Elias answered each question without looking up from the folder. When the man reached the torque sequence, Lillian spoke for the first time in an hour, her voice quiet but steady, the same voice that had trained half the dock crew back when the place still ran on paper ledgers and handwritten receipts. She recited the numbers exactly as they had been tested the night the crate was sealed. The adjuster checked his own sheet, initialed, and left without another word. 8 hours and 40 minutes. The log kept lengthening, each new signature another small piece of ground held. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted across the concrete floor, and the generator's steady thrum filled the spaces between knocks. Lillian let her hand rest on the note's edge once more, just long enough to feel its shape, then pulled back as the next face appeared at the door. The next face belonged to a man in a pressed navy coat who introduced himself as the freight terminal supervisor. He had a clipboard and a list of weight tolerances that didn't match the ones Elias had been using all afternoon. The supervisor tapped his pen on the top sheet and said the dock scale showed an extra 43 pounds the drawings hadn't accounted for. If they couldn't explain it, the whole shipment would have to wait for a second inspection at the Port Authority scale, and that would push everything past the buyer's cutoff. Lillian kept her hand flat on the log while Elias asked for the supervisor's reading. The numbers came back different by just enough to matter. Outside the door the generator kept its low, steady note, but the room felt tighter now. Lillian slid the folded paper an inch closer to her wrist, feeling the familiar crease against her skin, and waited for the right line in the conversation. When the supervisor reached the torque sequence again, she spoke the same figures she had given the adjuster, only this time she added the date of the original test and the name of the man who had witnessed it. The supervisor checked his list twice, then lowered the clipboard. He initialed the margin and said the extra pounds were probably just the difference in packing straps from the old stock. The door closed behind him, and the clock in Lillian's head moved to 8 hours and 10 minutes. Evelyn called again with word that the truck driver was asking for a copy of the revised manifest. Elias answered the same way he had answered every call, when the entries are complete, and Lillian felt the note's edge under her palm once more. She wondered how many more times that single piece of paper would have to stand in for the years she had spent at the drafting table before anyone else in the room had even been hired. The generator kept its rhythm. Another knock came, this one softer. A younger man in a messenger's jacket stepped inside and handed over an envelope marked with the buyer's seal. Inside was a revised purchase order that lowered the agreed price by almost a third, citing unverified provenance. Elias read it aloud, his voice even. Lillian set the wrench down on the cloth and reached for the log one more time. She turned to the very first page, the one written in her own hand the night the crate was sealed, and read the line that listed the original material certificate number. The messenger copied it down, folded the paper back into the envelope, and left without asking for anything else. 7 hours and 55 minutes. The afternoon light had narrowed into a single stripe across the concrete. Lillian let her thumb rest against the note's corner, just long enough to feel the paper give, then drew her hand away as the next set of footsteps sounded in the hallway. The footsteps belonged to the night foreman, a man who'd only been on the roster 3 years and still walked like the floor owed him something. He stopped in the doorway with a clipboard of his own and said the forklift had thrown a code that afternoon. "Won't lift past the second notch," he told Elias. "We move it now or we risk the whole rig when the gate opens at 7. Lillian kept her hand flat on the note while the two men argued the schedule. She could feel the faint ridge where her own pen had pressed too hard all those years ago. The generator hummed on, steady as ever, and she waited until the foreman paused for breath. "Try the auxiliary bypass on the left housing," she said, not looking up. "It's the one with the red lock wire. You'll get the extra notch without resetting the whole panel." The foreman stared at her a moment, then turned on his heel and left. Elias didn't ask how she knew. He just marked the time on his own sheet, 7 hours and 40 minutes, and went back to the manifest. Lillian let the quiet settle again. The stripe of light on the concrete had crept another inch. A call came in on the wall phone. Evelyn again, this time with word that the buyer's representative wanted photographs of every weld seam before he'd release the final deposit. Elias held the receiver out so Lillian could hear the list of angles they were demanding. She answered without rising. "Tell them the seams were inspected at 2:17 in the morning, Bay 3, under the sodium lights. The inspector's name is still on the first page." Elias relayed the information, and the line went quiet for a long stretch before Evelyn came back with a confirmation. The photographs would be taken from the listed angles only. No extra crew required. 6 hours and 50 minutes. The next knock was the same messenger, back with a second envelope. This one carried a handwritten note from the auction house itself. The reserve price had been questioned again, this time because the crate's weight log showed a 2-pound discrepancy from the original filing. Lillian opened the log to the page she had already marked. She read the exact line about the packing straps again, then added the date the straps had been swapped for the heavier gauge. The messenger wrote it down, initialed the margin, and left. The clock in her head ticked to 6 hours and 25 minutes. Elias poured 2 cups from the thermos that had been sitting on the bench since noon. He set one near Lillian without comment. She lifted it, felt the warmth through the paper cup, and set it down untouched. The note stayed under her palm. Another set of footsteps approached, heavier this time. The supervisor returned with 2 men in buyer jackets. They wanted the crate opened for a visual check of the serial numbers. Elias stood, but Lillian stayed seated. She waited until the older of the 2 buyers reached for the latch. "The numbers are stamped on the inside lip," she said. "You'll need a mirror and the low-angle light from the cart. Otherwise you'll only see the shadow." The man hesitated, then called for the light. When the numbers matched the log, he signed the inspection form without another word. 5 hours and 50 minutes. The generator kept its steady rhythm while the door closed behind them. Lillian traced the corner of the note once more. The paper had softened from the warmth of her hand, but the crease still held. She wondered how many more times it would have to serve as proof before the room understood the difference between a record and a memory. The light on the concrete had thinned to a narrow blade. Outside the hallway, another phone rang, and Evelyn's voice carried through the open door with word that the truck driver was now asking for a second signature on the revised manifest. Elias answered the same as before. Lillian kept her thumb on the note and let the minutes run. The phone kept ringing in the outer office, and Evelyn's voice rose just enough to carry through the half-open door. She was explaining the manifest again, the same line she'd repeated twice already, but the truck driver on the other end wanted something fresh, an extra line initialed by someone with authority. Elias looked toward Lillian, waiting. She didn't move. The note stayed under her palm, the crease deepening under her thumb. She lifted the paper cup, took one slow sip, and set it down. The coffee had cooled to lukewarm, the kind of temperature that told you more time had slipped by than you meant to lose. 3 hours and 40 minutes. Another set of footsteps came down the concrete hallway, lighter than the buyer's but quicker. It was the young clerk from the front desk, the one who had asked earlier if Lillian needed a chair with better padding. He stopped in the doorway, holding a clipboard with the revised weight log. "They're saying the straps still don't match the original manifest," he said. "The driver won't load until it's settled." Lillian opened the log to the page she had marked the night before. She read the entry about the strap change out loud, the same words she had written in her own hand years ago when the crate first left the workshop. The clerk listened, then wrote the date in the margin and added his initials. He looked at the note under her hand but didn't ask about it. "That should hold them," he said, and turned back toward the hallway. The generator kept its steady hum while the door clicked shut. Elias poured the rest of the thermos into his own cup and took a long drink. He didn't press her to eat or rest. He knew better than to fill the quiet with words that wouldn't change anything. Lillian traced the edge of the note once more, feeling the softened paper give under her fingertip. The crease had started to fray at one corner, but the ink inside still held clear. 2 hours and 55 minutes. The supervisor returned, this time alone. He stood just inside the doorway, his clipboard tucked under one arm, and studied the crate as if the numbers might have changed since the last inspection. "The auction house wants one more confirmation on the serial sequence," he said. "They're worried about a mismatch with the catalog photo." Lillian stayed seated. She waited until the supervisor reached for the latch again, then spoke the same way she had earlier. "The sequence runs left to right on the inside rim," she said. "You'll need to tilt the mirror so the light catches the stamping from below." The supervisor hesitated, then called for the same low-angle lamp the buyers had used. When the numbers lined up with the catalog entry, he signed the form and handed it to Elias without another question. The door closed behind him, and the hallway fell quiet again except for the distant ring of Evelyn's phone. Lillian pressed her thumb along the note's crease. She could feel the warmth from her own hand still trapped inside the fold. Outside, the truck's engine turned over once, then settled into idle. The driver was waiting for the final manifest, the same one Evelyn had been explaining for the better part of an hour. Elias stood and stretched his back, the way he always did when the waiting stretched too long. He didn't ask Lillian what she was thinking. He simply moved the thermos to the far end of the bench so it wouldn't block the light. 1 hour and 40 minutes. A new voice joined Evelyn's in the outer office, deeper and slower. It was the auction house manager this time, the one who had questioned the reserve price that morning. He wanted to see the crate in person before the final catalog update. Evelyn's answer came through the open door, steady but thinner than before. She said the inspection had already been logged twice. The manager's reply carried the same polished tone he had used when he first dismissed the weight discrepancy. He wanted to check the serials himself. Lillian kept her hand on the note. The paper had grown warm enough that the crease no longer felt sharp. She wondered how many more signatures would be needed before the room accepted what was already written in the old log. The generator clicked once, then settled back into its rhythm. Elias poured what was left of the coffee into a fresh cup and set it beside her without comment. She lifted it, felt the heat through the paper, and let it sit while the footsteps in the hallway grew closer. The footsteps belonged to the manager, of course. You could hear it in the way he slowed at the doorway, like a man who still expected the room to rearrange itself around his say-so. He stepped inside with his suit jacket buttoned and that same polished watch catching the light, the one he'd checked the first time he'd told Lillian the crate wasn't worth the space it took. "We'll need to confirm the serials again," he said, voice even, the way people talk when they already know the answer they want. Lillian didn't stand. She simply turned the note so the crease caught the same low lamp. The numbers were there, the same ones she'd written 40 years earlier in the back room of the old gallery on Mercer Street, before the place changed hands and the records got boxed away. Elias watched the manager lean in. The generator hummed steady behind them. The manager's finger traced the stamp once, then twice, and the polished certainty in his face shifted by a fraction. He asked for the manifest. Evelyn handed it over without a word. 1 hour and 50 minutes had passed since the truck had idled outside. The manager read the entry, looked again at the crate, and set the paper down. "This shouldn't have taken this long," he said quietly, to no one in particular. Then he looked at Lillian. "You kept the original log?" She nodded once. The note stayed warm under her thumb. By the time they wheeled the crate into the auction room the next morning, the seats were already half full. The same buyers who had walked past earlier now stood at the rail, checking their catalogs. The manager took his place at the side table, the one reserved for house staff. When the lot number was called, he read the description exactly as Evelyn had logged it the night before. No one interrupted. The bidding started low, then climbed again until the room went still at the final figure. The gavel came down once. The manager signed the sale sheet and slid it across to Lillian. Afterward, in the small office behind the auction floor, he closed the door and stood with his hands on the back of a chair. "I told you to take the crate and go," he said. "I was wrong. You had the proof the whole time, and I didn't want to see it." He didn't look away when he said it. Lillian folded the note smaller and slipped it into her coat pocket. She told him the same thing she'd told Evelyn an hour earlier, the record had never changed, only the people reading it. 2 days later the apology came again, this time in the main gallery where the new owners had gathered to see the piece before it shipped. The manager stood at the front and said the words out loud, steady and without the earlier polish. The room listened. Lillian stayed at the back with Elias, the thermos between them on the bench the way it had been in the hallway. The note rested in her palm, the crease softened flat from all the times she traced it. In the weeks that followed the piece found its place in a public collection, the same way the old logbooks eventually did. Lillian went back to the small workshop on the edge of town where she'd always kept her tools. Elias still brought coffee on the mornings the light was right for checking stamps. The note stayed in the top drawer of her bench, the one she opened when the next crate arrived and someone new asked why the numbers mattered. What stayed with her wasn't the price or the signatures. It was the way the room had gone quiet when the truth sat plain on the table, the same quiet that comes after a long day's work when you finally set the last piece down and know it's square. Age doesn't erase the record, it only makes the reading slower for those who never learn to look from the right angle. The people who kept showing up, day after day, with their hands on the work, were the ones who carried the real weight forward. That was the debt settled, not in any single moment, but in the simple fact that the next person to open the crate would find the numbers already straight.